In this position, does black want to go first or second? 1 e3 e2 check, or 1 king d1 e1? Incorrect. Black doesn't want to move first, because then he'd have no better than a draw. Either he would have to check, 1 e3 e2 check, or move his king to the side, which doesn't get anywhere. The check leads to an immediate draw. After white's king blocks the pawn, 2 king d1 e1, black would have to move his king either to e3, 2 king d3 e3, giving stalemate, or away from the pawn, say 2 king d3 d4, abandoning it altogether. White could then capture the pawn. 3 king e1 takes e2, and the game would conclude at this point, for neither side possesses sufficient mating material, enough material to force mate regardless what the opponent does. If in the above position advancing the pawn to the 7th rank gives check, as a rule the game is drawn. The position is winning, however, if the pawn moves to the 7th rank without giving check, for then the opposing king is forced off the home rank, and there's no stalemate. Nor in the given position does moving the king away from the promotion area, say 1 king d3 d4, help either. White simply moves his king to e1 or e2, staying on the same file as the pawn. To draw, all white has to do is shift his king back and forth between these two squares, e1 and e2. If ever black's king moves to d3, white draws by moving his king to d1, taking the opposition. If black instead has the chance to maneuver his king to f3, white keeps the draw by moving his king to f1. In both cases, white's king holds the draw by opposing the black king as it comes to the attacker's 6th rank. In other words, white draws by taking the opposition. Correct. If black goes second, white will have to step to the side, 1 king d1 e1, and the black pawn can advance to the 7th rank without giving check, 1 e3 e2. This will squeeze white's king off the home rank, 2 king e1 f2. Black will counter by moving his king ahead, 2 king d3 d2, which takes control of the promotion square and ensures the making of a new queen on the next turn. It turns out that neither player wants to move in the given position. If black goes first, he draws, and black doesn't want to draw because he has the pawn. And if white goes first, he loses, and nobody wants to lose. A situation where neither player wants to move is called a mutual Zugzwang. Here it comes down to the opposition. The opposition is a term referring to the relationship between the two kings. If you have the opposition, it essentially means that you have the advantage, and that your king is in a position to exploit what the other king does. Why? Because you move second. Therefore, you can wait and see what's best, based on what the other side has done. Where should white move his king? 1 king g5 f6, or 1 king g5 g6? Incorrect. Moving in this way, 1 king g5 f6, is quite natural, wanting to head toward the promotion square as soon as possible. But here it backfires, for it allows black to take the opposition by moving the king to f8, 1 king g8 f8. This draws, for if white advances the pawn to the 7th rank, 2 e6 e7 check, it's check. According to the rule, checking on the 7th rank with the pawn shouldn't win. The push gets nowhere after black's king slides over to e8, 2 king f8 e8, drawing next move by stalemate, 3 king f6 e6, or insufficient mating material, say 3 king f6 f5, king e8 takes e7. And suppose white doesn't give a check on the second move. Let's assume he moves his king somewhere instead, say 2 king f6 e5. Black will then draw by shuttling his king between e7 and e8, waiting for white's king to move up to its sixth rank, to either d6 or f6. At this point, black draws by taking the opposition. He will move his king to d8 when white's king is on d6, or to f8 when white's king is on f6. Correct. Invading on king knight 6, 1 king g5 g6 is the winning way, for it gives white the opposition. Black's best response is to move the king over to f8, 1 king g8 f8, whereupon white's king also moves over, 2 king g6 f6, maintaining the opposition, and ensuring that the pawn will advance to the seventh rank without giving check. After 2 king f8 e8, white pushes the pawn, 3 e6 e7. It's not check, and black's king is squeezed off the back rank. Black could resign here, for moving the king to d7, 3 king e8 d7, is followed by the incursion of white's king to f7, 4 king f6 f7, with the pawn promoting, 5 e8 queen next move. Should white move his king or pawn? 1 king c5 d5 or 1 d4 d5? Correct. White's voracious strategy is to move the king, 1 king c5 d5, seizing the direct opposition. Black's king will then have to give ground to the right or left. If black plays his king to c7, 1 king d7 c7, white's king turns up the board to e6, 2 king d5 e6. And if black's monarch instead plays to e7, 1 king d7 e7, white's king has a turning maneuver up to c6, 2 king d5 c6. In both instances, the white king has gotten to its sixth rank, ahead of its pawn, which is the general method of winning. A sample variation might go 1 king c5 d5, king d7 c7, 2 king d5 e6, king c7 d8, 3 d4 d5, king d8 e8, taking a meaningless opposition which can't be maintained, 4 d5 d6, giving white a meaningful opposition with the pawn on its sixth rank. Black gets squeezed out after 4 king e8 d8, 5 d6 d7, and white makes a queen in two moves, 5 king d8 c7, 6 king e6 e7, king c7 c6, 7 d7 d8 queen. Incorrect. Pushing the pawn, 1 d4 d5, is a mistake. It enables black to steal the opposition meaningfully by 1 king d7 c7, and white has no way to regain it, assuming best play on the part of both combatants. In all situations, we should assume that the opponent will play the best moves, because even if he's inexperienced, he might play correctly by accident. Chess players don't gamble with the future unless the situation dictates it. For example, they're hopelessly lost, so they have nothing to lose. Let's look at a concrete variation. After 1 d4 d5, king d7 c7, 2 d5 d6 check, king c7 d7, 3 king c5 d5, black holds the draw by retreating back to d8, 3 king d7 d8, waiting for white's king to come to its 6th rank. At this point, black will hold by taking the opposition. That is, he will answer 4 king d5 c6 by 4 king d8 c8, or 4 king d5 e6 by 4 king d8 e8 when white cannot advance the pawn to its 7th rank without giving check. So the game is drawn. To draw the game, should black move his king to f7 or f8, 1 king g8 f7, or 1 king g8 f8? Incorrect. Moving the king to f7, 1 king g8 f7, seems to be more aggressive, but it actually puts the king in a hole, for white garners the direct opposition by 2 king f4 f5. With precise play, the king will be able to reach its 6th rank ahead of its pawn. For example, if black continues 2 king f7 e7, white maintains the opposition with 3 king f5 e5, and black will have to give ground, shifting the king to either d7, 3 king e7 d7, or f7, 3 king e7 f7. White then follows with a turning maneuver, placing his own king squarely on its 6th rank. This he does by answering 3 king e7 d7 with 4 king e5 f6, or 3 king e7 f7 with 4 king e5 d6. From there, it's a matter of utilizing the opposition so that the pawn advances to its 7th rank without giving check, which white can ensure by force. Correct. Black can escape with a draw by 1 king g8 f8, taking the distant opposition, and waiting for white to commit himself to a king placement. That is, if white now plays 2 king f4 f5, black will maintain the opposition with 2 king f8 f7, and if white instead plays 2 king f4 e5, then black keeps the opposition with 2 king f8 e7. In neither case can white make headway to regain the opposition. Black's opposition is meaningful, and the game is drawn. A sample conclusion might go 1 king g8 f8, 2 king f4 e5, king f8 e7, 3 king e5 d5, king e7 d7, 4 e4 e5, king d7 e7. Note that his own pawn prevents white from taking the opposition by occupying e5, which is the square needed by the white king. 5 e5 e6, a bad omen for white because the pawn has preceded its king to its 6th rank. 5 king e7 e8, 6 king d5 d6, king e8 d8, taking the critical opposition as soon as white's king reaches its 6th rank. 7 e6 e7 check, a check on the 7th rank, which is another bad sign for white. 7 king d8 e8, 8 king d6 e6, stalemate. The distant opposition is another expression of the oppositional relationship. As a general rule, when kings inhabit the same line, the same rank, file, or diagonal, they stand in opposition if two things are true: if both kings occupy squares of the same color, and if they are separated by an odd number of squares along the line of occupation. Thus the kings stand in opposition when white's king is on g2 and black's king is on a8, but not when white's king is on g2 and black's king is on b7. When, as in the latter instance, the kings don't already stand in opposition, whoever moves can usually take the opposition. So with white's king on g2 and black's on b7, black to play can take the opposition by moving his king to c6 or a8. Meanwhile, white to play can take the opposition by moving his king to either F3 or H1. Should black take a pawn or simply move his king? 1. King b3 takes c4, or 1. King b3, b4. Incorrect. Taking either pawn leads to a draw. Let's say black takes the c-pawn. 1. King b3 takes c4. White will counter by taking black's a-pawn. 2. King b6 takes a5. Then it becomes a race to see who will queen first, and even then it might not matter. The game is probably still drawn as long as both players queen on the same move, and neither one is hindered by virtue of being in check. There are many entertaining twists on this scenario, as in the concluding scene from the film Searching for Bobby Fischer. So after 1. King b3 takes c4, 2. King b6 takes a5, the position should be drawn after 2. King c4 b3, 3. King a5 b6, c5 c4. Now it doesn't help on move 3 to take white's a-pawn. 3. King b3 takes a4. For white then takes black's c-pawn. 4. King b6 takes c5, and the game is drawn, because there's nothing left. The concluding moves after 3 c5 c4 are likely to be 4 a4 a5, 5 c4 c3, a5 a6, 6 c3 c2, a6 a7, 7 c2 c1 promote to queen, a7 a8 promote to queen, when both players have added a queen. Although black can be the first to start giving checks, he can't do any real damage with them. The position is drawn. A similar draw would also result from a different initial capture. If black instead were to take the a-pawn, 1. King b3 takes a4. This too would lead to comparably harmless promotions for both sides, where neither player comes out on top. Correct. Instead of trading pawns, black can prevent white from getting anything by delaying the capture in favor of taking the opposition. 1. King b3, b4. No matter which way the white king now goes, black can take a pawn while keeping his own pawns protected. The result is that black gets both white pawns, and white gets nothing. If white replies to 1. King b3, b4 by moving his king to the c-file, 2. King b6, c6, black takes the c-pawn, 2. King b4 takes c4, and white is fleeced. And if white instead moves his king to the a-file, 2. King b6, a6, then the a-pawn is filched. 2. King b4 takes a4. And again white gets zilch. Black will soon be on his way to making a new queen, and white is as helpless to stop it as a high schooler trying to guard Michael Jordan. Which pawn move should white make? 1 b5 b6 check, or 1 b7 b8 promote to queen check? Incorrect. Pushing the b5 pawn, 1 b5 b6 check, is a clear mistake. Black will retreat the king to b8, 1 king a7 b8, and white must abandon the b7 pawn, say 2 king c6 c5, for he has no place to put the king that keeps the pawn protected. After the pawn is taken, 2 king b8 takes b7. Black's king is in perfect shape to control the draw. It plays back and forth between b7 and b8, waiting for white's king to come up to the 6th rank. Whenever this happens, black will be armed to take the opposition, while white is unable to advance the pawn without giving check, so the position is drawn. Correct. It turns out that 2 pawns are too much. If white wants to win, he needs to ditch one of them, the front one, by advancing it to the last row. 1, b7, b8, promote to queen, check. Note that moving the white king up 1 square, 1, king c6, c7, doesn't help, for this is stalemate. Back to the prudent sacrifice, 1, b7, b8, promote to queen, check. After black takes the queen, 1, king a7 takes b8, white doesn't have to worry about giving stalemate any longer, because now he has much more room for maneuvering. It's a palpable case of less being more. The win is now simple. White takes the opposition, 2, king c6, b6, and regardless whether black moves his king to the left or right, white wins by moving his king up 1 square in the other direction. That is, in response to black's king moving to the corner, 2, king b8, a8, white clears a path for the pawn by advancing his king to c7, 3, king b6, c7. Meanwhile, if black's king goes the other way, 2, king b8, c8, white wins by reversing direction, 3, king b6, a7, and again the pawn is unstoppable. Should black move his pawn or king? 1, b6, b5, or 1, king a8, b7? Correct. Superficially, advancing 1, b6, b5 appears absurd, inasmuch as white can gain the pawn perforce. White acquires it by moving his king to either c5 or c6, and black can do nothing to save it. But this doesn't matter, for after 2, king d5, c6, king a8, b8, 3, king c6 takes b5, white indeed has won a pawn, but black gains a meaningful opposition, with 3, king b8, b7. This Promethean defense will prevent white's king from ever getting to its 6th rank ahead of its pawn. For instance, the game would remain drawn after 4, king b5, c5, king b7, c7, 5, b4, b5. This last move gets white the opposition, but it's a meaningless opposition because it can't be maintained. Black proves this by continuing 5, king c7, b7, when white is unable to take the opposition because his own pawn blocks b5. So white advances it 6, b5, b6, but this means that the pawn precedes its own king to the 6th rank, which is a no-no. Black therefore withdraws his king, king b7, b8, making sure to stay on the same file as the pawn, so that after 7, king c5, c6, black can take a meaningful opposition by 7, king b8, c8. No progress can be made. If white pushes his pawn, 8, b6, b7 check, it's with check on the 7th rank, and this too doesn't work. The game would then end after 8, king c8, b8, for 9, king c6, b6 is stalemate. Clearly, in king and pawn endings, material isn't everything. Surely the quality of the material also matters, as does the position of the 2 kings. If one is especially dominant, it may be able to compensate for an overall deficit in force by deterring the opponent's king from doing its job. Incorrect. Actively using the king tends to be an apropos approach, but here 1, king a8, b7 leads to defeat. True, black doesn't drop the pawn for a few moves, but he does lose it for sure, beginning with the stultifying advance 2, b4, b5. Now black is going to run out of maneuvering room, even after 2, king b7, c7. White's king merely enters on e6, dances its way over to c6 or c7, and the pawn falls when black's king is denied space and places to go. A possible winning variation might be 3 King d5 e6, King c7 c8, taking a meaningless diagonal opposition, 4 King e6 d6, King c8 b7, 5 King d6 d7, the dance of death continues, 5 King b7 b8, 6 King d7 c6, King b8 a7, when after 7 King c6 c7, black must cede the b-pawn to white's invasive king, 7 King a7 a8, 8 King c7 takes b6. The terminating moves might be 8 King a8 b8, taking the opposition, but a valueless one, for white's king is already on the 6th rank, ahead of its pawn, so the opposition can't be maintained. 9 King b6 a6, King b8 a8, 10 b5 b6, King a8 b8, 11 b6 b7, advancing the pawn to its 7th rank without giving check. This will squeeze black's king off the back rank, 11 King b8 c7, and white's own king advances to its 7th rank, 12 King a6 a7, supporting the pawn's promotion on the very next move. Which pawn should black move? The b-pawn or the c-pawn? Correct. Moving the b-pawn, 1 b4 b3, creates a decisive breakthrough. No matter how white replies, black is assured of sneaking a pawn past the enemy defenders to become a new queen. Let's say that white takes with the a-pawn, 2 a2 takes b3. In this case, it's the a4 pawn that eventually promotes, but only after black first offers another sacrifice, the c-pawn at c3, 2 c4 c3. This threatens to capture on b2, so white has no practical choice. He must take on c3, 3 b2 takes c3, just for self-defense, whereupon black's a-pawn penetrates with 3 a4 a3. It queens in 2 moves. Black wins in a similar way if on move 2 it's white's c-pawn that captures on b3, 2 c2 takes b3. In this instance, black breaks through with his c-pawn by first sacrificing the a-pawn, 2 a4 a3. White again has no viable choice. He must accept the offering, 3 b2 takes a3, and now the c-pawn scurries toward the c1 promotion square, 3 c4 c3, soon to emerge as a new queen. Incorrect. Advancing the queen-bishop pawn, 1 c4 c3, fails to the direct exchange 2 b2 takes c3. After black recaptures 2 b4 takes c3, white's king heads back toward the queen side, 3 King h6 g6, and black stands to lose both his remaining pawns. If it were white's move to start with, he could prevent the breakthrough combination by actually obstructing the advance of black's middle pawn. This he could do by 1 b2 b3. After the ensuing exchanges, 1 a4 takes b3, 2 a2 takes b3, c4 takes b3, 3 c2 takes b3, white's king can get back to win the then solitary black pawn, but black's own king will be able to gain a meaningful opposition afterward to draw. In other words, when white's king captures on b4, black's king will be able to move to b6, taking the direct opposition and halting further progress. The variation might go 3 King h8 g8, 4 King h6 g6, King g8 f8, 5 King g6 f6, King f8 e8, 6 King f6 e6, King e8 d8, 7 King e6 d6, King d8 c8, 8 king d6 c5, king c8 c7, 9 king c5 takes b4, king c7 b6, gaining the direct opposition with a draw in hand. A sample conclusion without comment is 10 king b4 c4, king b6 c6, 11 b3 b4, king c6 b6, 12 b4 b5, king b6 b7, 13 king c4 c5, king b7 c7, 14 b5 b6 check, king c7 b7, 15 king c5 b5, king b7 b8, 16 king b5 a6, king b8 a8, 17 b6 b7 check, king a8 b8, 18 king a6 b6 stalemate. Which pawn should black push, the A pawn or the C pawn? Correct. Black has what's called the outside passed pawn, which here is represented by the A pawn. In general, such a pawn is outside the main theater of action, and often can be used as a decoy to lure away the opposing king. With the opposing king thus removed, the friendly king can move in on the suddenly vulnerable targets, possibly cleaning up the remaining pawns without resistance. After 1 a5 a4, white has nothing better than 2 king c2 b2, whereupon black can ditch the A pawn, 2 a4 a3 check, or even just invade with his king, 2 king c4 d3. Either way soon winning the two white pawns and ensuring the promotion of his remaining C pawn. Incorrect. Moving the C pawn 1 c6 c5 is a blunder. Why should black offer to trade C pawn for D pawn when he can win the D pawn by force? As a rule, you don't trade what you might be able to win. So the defender simply exchanges pawns. 2 d4 takes c5, king c4 takes c5, and after 3 king c2 b3, white will be able to survive without much hassle. In fact, at this point, white doesn't even have to defend his C pawn. If black should actually win it, he'd be left with the A pawn alone, and there's no way that the A pawn can be forced through to queen with white's king already in front of it. There'd be no way to force the white king out of the corner. Try it. You'll see what I mean. Just keep shuttling your king between A1 and B1. Eventually, black will be constrained to advance his A pawn to its 7th rank, and stalemate ensues. Should black move his king or pawn? 1 king f4 f3 or 1 g4 g3 check? Correct. Invading with the king, 1 king f4 f3 gains the white h pawn in a couple of moves. White will have to give ground, say 2 king h2 g1, and black then shifts over to attack white's lonesome pawn 2 king f3 g3, which can't be protected. Next turn, black usurps the pawn 3 king g3 takes h4, with promotion soon to follow. A sample variation is 3 king g1 h1, king g3 takes h4, 4 king h1 h2, taking a meaningless opposition, 4 g4 g3 check, 5 king h2 g2, king h4 g4, 6 king g2 g1, king g4 f3, 7 king g1 f1, g3 g2 check. This check is okay because of the extra pawn on the h-file, which enables black to avert stalemate. 8 king f1 g1, h5 h4, 9 king g1 h2, king f3 f2, 10 king h2 h3, g2 g1 promote to queen, 11 king h3 takes h4, queen g1 g6, chasing the white king back the other way, 12 king h4 h3, queen g6 h5, checkmate, or 12 queen g6 g3, checkmate. Incorrect. Pushing the pawn 1 g4 g3 check may look delicious, but it's actually quite unsavory. After white hides his king at h3, 2 king h2 h3, black must either abandon his g-pawn, which leads to a drawn game because only rook pawns would remain, or keep the g-pawn guarded by 2 king f4 f3, which is stalemate on any continent. Where should white move his king? To d2 or to c2? Incorrect. The natural move is 1 king d1 d2, but it's also the wrong move. Black will be able to get his king over just in time to draw. For example, after 1 king f8 e7, 2 king d2 d3, black retains his dignity with 2 king e7 d7, taking the distant opposition and waiting for white's king to commit itself to c4 or d4. If the king goes to c4, 3 king d3 c4, black maintains the opposition by moving his king to c6, 3 king d7 c6. And if the white king instead goes to d4, 3 king d3 d4, black keeps the opposition by going to d6, 3 king d7 d6. In each case, black holds the opposition and guarantees a draw. Correct. The right move is 1 king d1 c2, heading for the outside critical square at b5. In king and pawn endings, a square is critical if its occupation by the superior side's king creates a winning position. This doesn't imply that the position isn't winning before the square is occupied by the dominant side's king. It simply means that further progress can't be made until such an occupation is realized. Most passed pawns are associated with a set of critical squares. The critical squares tend to be 2 ranks ahead of the passed pawn to which they correspond. So, with a white pawn on c3, the critical squares are b5, c5, and d5. If white's king can reach any of these 3 squares, white will be able to force a win. If black's king can stop white from doing this, from reaching b5, c5, or d5 with a white pawn on c3, the game would be drawn. Here, the move 1 king d1 c2 enables white's king to get to the outside critical square b5 by force. The game might then continue 1 king f8 e7, 2 king c2 b3, king e7 d6, 3 king b3 b4, threatening to move the king to b5. The only way black can try to stop this beachhead is by moving his king over to c6, 3 king d6 c6, which actually guards b5, preventing its immediate occupation by the white king. Nonetheless, white can then take the direct opposition by 4 king b4 c4, with a position that can be won by force. Black's king will have to step to the side, to b6 or d6, and white's king advances to a critical square, to either d5 or b5, depending which way black has gone. From there, white wins by carefully escorting his pawn to the promotion square. Should black move his king toward the corner or toward the center? 1 King G1 H1 or 1 King G1 F1? Correct. The ridiculous-looking move 1 King G1 H1 is the best move. Although it seems to be moving the king away from the action, it's actually bringing it closer to the critical line of retreat, the B8 H2 diagonal. By using this diagonal, black's king is able to occupy C7 immediately after white's king captures the black pawn on A7. This will soon produce a draw. For example, after 1 King G1 H1, 2 King G3 F3, black's king can chase white's king along the proper channel by moving to H2. There could follow 3 King F3 E4, King H2 G3, 4 King E4 D5, King G3 F4, 5 King D5 C6, King F4 E5, 6 King C6 B7, King E5 D6, 7 King B7 takes A7 when black traps the white king by 7 King D6 C7. And if white deigns to continue by occupying the corner, 8 King A7 A8, the game is likely to end with black stalemating white, 8 King C7 B6, 9 A6 A7, King B6 C7. Incorrect. Moving the king toward the center, 1 King G1 F1 loses, starting with the reply 2 King G3 F3. If black then tries to get on the right line, the B8 H2 diagonal, by going back the other way, 2 King F1 G1, white uses his extra tempo to gain the victory. 3 King F3 E4, King G1 F2, playing the black king to H2 is no longer germane, try it and see. 4 King E4 D5, King F2 E3, 5 King D5 C6, King E3 D4, 6 King C6 B7, King D4 C5, 7 King B7 takes A7, King C5 C6, 8 King A7 B8, and the pawn can't be stopped. So this example represents another one of those strange chess cases which seem to defy the rules. By moving further away, 1 King G1 H1, in some sense black was actually moving closer, that is, closer to the critical diagonal leading to the key defensive square C7. This example also shows the value of diagonal king moves, which can often do the seemingly impossible. Often, not always. Which pawn should white advance, the A pawn or the D pawn? Incorrect. Pushing the A pawn, 1 A2 A4, the outside passed pawn, is naturally the idea to be considered first, for typically it would be the hardest pawn for the opposing king to catch. But it's easy to see that after the black king starts its retreat along the critical A8 H1 diagonal, 1 King F3 E4, the A pawn is going to be overtaken and won. 2 A4 A5, King E4 D5, 3 A5 A6, King D5 C6, 4 A6 A7, King C6 B7, and indeed the pawn falls. Generally, there's a visual trick enabling you to tell if a passed pawn can be caught by the defending king. Draw a mental line from the square on which the pawn sits to the square of promotion. This imaginary line forms the side of a mentally constructed box of squares. If the defending king can move inside the box, it can catch the pawn. If the king can't do this, the pawn will queen. For example, with the white a-pawn on a5, the box contains 16 squares, and runs from a5 to a8, to d8, to d5, to a5. If black's king can enter the box at d5, or d6, d7, d8, c5, or b5, the pawn becomes dead meat. From the starting position of our example, this very thing, 2 king e4 d5, is done on black's second move. Correct. White can prevent black's king from utilizing the critical diagonal of retreat by sacrificing his d-pawn, 1 d4 d5. Black must take the pawn, which creates a block at d5. This obstacle prevents black's king from getting back to stop the pawn because the critical diagonal of retreat, a8 h1, is now closed. 2 a2 a4, king f3 e4, 3 a4 a5, and now black is unable to enter the square at d5, and the pawn queens by force. So after 2 a2 a4, the defender has nothing better than trying a counterattack, 2 d5 d4. Black thereby hopes that after 3 a4 a5, d4 d3, white will continue the pedestrian advance of his a-pawn, 4 a5 a6, which permits black to turn the tables by 4 d3 d2, queening and soon mating. But white doesn't have to fall for this stratagem, for he can answer black's third move, 3 d4 d3, by employing a little defense, 4 king f1 e1, and this stops the black d-pawn in its tracks. On the next move, white's a-pawn can proceed merrily on its way, 5 a5 a6. Should black move his king toward the white pawn, or away from it? 1 king e1 f2, or 1 king e1 d2. Incorrect. Black has no real chance to catch the pawn with a direct attack, 1 king e1 f2, for white just pushes ahead, 2 g3 g4, and the pawn will queen for sure. A king is simply unable to overtake a pawn with a 2-rank head start in a pawn race. In order to do this, there would have to be a tactical trick that gains time, and 1 king e1 f2 doesn't do it. Correct. Here's another chess paradox. By apparently veering away from the pawn, 1 king e1 d2, black actually winds up moving closer to it. It comes down to this. Moving toward his own pawn enables black to muster a time-gaining threat, which white can't ignore. White is forced to play a defensive move, and it's this tempo that salvages the draw. The analysis confirms it. After 1 king e1 d2, white can try to win in either of two ways. He can take the black pawn, 2 king c5 takes b5, though this permits black to gain on the white pawn diagonally, 2 king d2 e3, leading to its capture in two moves, 3 g3 g4, king e3 f4, 4 g4 g5, king f4 takes g5. Or he can start the g-pawn on its way at once, 2 g3 g4. To this, black continues in his paradoxical manner, moving his king even further away, with 2 king d2 c3. This threatens to protect his own pawn by pushing it to b4. Either both sides will now queen innocuously, as in the line 3 g4 g5, b5 b4, 4 g5 g6, b4 b3, 5 g6 g7, b3 b2, 6 g7 g8 promote to queen, b2 b1 promote to queen, which should end in a draw. Or white opts to take black's pawn, 3 king c5 takes b5, when black can then catch up with the g-pawn by heading back, 3 king c3 d4, 4 g4 g5, king d4 e5, 5 g5 g6, king e5 f6, and the pawn goes next move. Should white castle or move his king to d2, 1 castle kingside, or 1 king e1 d2? Incorrect. The principled move is to castle, 1 kingside castle, but this permits a decisive intrusion to the 7th rank, 1 rook c8 c2, when it becomes quite difficult for white to hold on to his pawns. For example, if 2 rook f1 b1, to defend the b-pawn, black pilfers the d-pawn by 2 rook c2 d2. Sometimes castling isn't the safest move at all. Sometimes it removes the king from an area that requires its support. Take away the king, and the region could become defenseless. Correct. The smarter move is 1 king e1 d2, keeping the king in the center, so that it can prevent the black rook from invading at c2. Moreover, with the king at d2, white now has the ability to offer a rook trade at c1, if he should deem this desirable. We have to be careful not to follow chess principles too mechanically. They can serve as helpful guidelines and directors, but they don't confer actual knowledge of the position in front of you. Only concrete analysis can do that. Should black push the pawn or defend it, 1 a3 a2, or 1 knight c3 b5? Incorrect. Advancing the pawn, 1 a3 a2, looks menacing, but it sets up a situation where no progress can be made after white retreats the king to king b3 b2. White will draw by transferring his king to and fro between a1 and b2. Is there any way that black can try to win? In order to pursue this adventure, he will have to free the knight from its defensive chore of guarding the a-pawn, which means the black king must be brought over to b3 or a3 to protect the pawn. This will free the knight all right, but it will deny the white king a safe move, which means that white is stalemated. Set this up on your own board and see what I mean. That is, place the black king on b3 or a3, the black pawn on a2, and the black knight on c3. Then put the white king on a1, and make it white's move. He doesn't have one, and it's not check, so this is stalemate. Correct. Guarding the pawn. 1 knight c3 b5 ensures the pawn's safety and the ultimate win, mainly because the black king is now able to defend the a-pawn without giving stalemate. Black can do this because the pawn remains on its 6th rank, which gives white some breathing room. Once black's king takes the reins and the knight is free to move, it doesn't take long to promote the pawn and deliver mate. A sample variation might go 2 king b3 a2, king f3 e3, 3 king a2 b3, king e3 d3, 4 king b3 a2, king d3 c3, 5 king a2 b1, king c3 b3, 6 king b1 a1. Now black must be careful. If he blunders with 6 knight b5 c3, it's stalemate. But the knight doesn't want to occupy the square c3. Rather, it needs to occupy c2, so that it can guard the a1 corner. This is achieved by 6 knight b5 d4. After 7 king a1 b1, black checks with the pawn, 7 a3 a2 check. Or he could play 7 knight d4 c2 first. And white has the unpleasant choice of moving his king toward the center, 8 king b1 c1, allowing the pawn to promote to a queen, or of moving the king to the corner, 8 king b1 a1, which ends in immediate mate, 8 knight d4 c2 checkmate. Should black get out of check by moving his king to f1 or to f2, 1 king g1 f1 or 1 king g1 f2? Correct. The game turns in black's favor after 1 king g1 f1. This attacks the knight and threatens to make a new queen. White at this point has but one plausible try, and this is to give check again at knight 3, 2 knight e2 g3 check. But black can end the checks once and for all by 2 king f1 e1. With the checks all gone, so is white's aspiration to stop the pawn, which queens by force. This shows the problem of the knight when it comes to dealing with wing pawns, here a knight pawn in particular. As the knight approaches the edge of the board, it runs out of maneuvering space, and certain tactical possibilities are no longer available. In order to draw in our given example, there would have to be a ninth file, so that the knight could transfer from g3 to I2. In this way, it could guard g1, thwarting the planned queening. But the I file doesn't exist, nor does black have any hope of stopping the coronation of white's g-pawn. Incorrect. It's easy to be careless. In black's desire to escape the checks, he could brashly play the mistake 1 king g1 f2. This ends the checks for now, but it doesn't ensure the win, for white has the tricky rejoinder 2 knight e2 f4, which attacks the pawn directly. Since white is quite happy to give up the knight to stop the pawn, black must promote. But after doing so, say 2 g2 g1 promote to queen, white has the forking check 3 knight f4 h3 check, and the queen is taken next move. After 4 king f2 f1, knight h3 takes g1, 5 king f1 takes g1, the game is drawn by insufficient mating material. Actually, the draw could be claimed after white takes the queen, 4 knight h3 takes g1, before his knight is seized, 5 king f1 takes g1, because at this point neither player has enough material left to force checkmate. Should black take the bishop or the knight? 1 king b7 takes b8, or 1 king b7 takes b6. Incorrect. Taking the bishop, 1 king b7 takes b8, is erroneous. It allows white to win with virtually no difficulty, for even though white has a rook pawn, the least ennobled of all the pawns, white's king and knight will work harmoniously as a team to clear the pawn's path. Most importantly, the knight can guard the a8 corner, preventing black from seeking a successful blockade and eventual stalemate. The dark square bishop, on the other hand, can't guard a8, and in this ending, that's a real failing. Correct. The right piece to take is the knight. 1 king b7 takes b6, which leaves white with a bishop that can't guard the corner square, a8. White has the so-called wrong bishop, and the game is positionally drawn. This becomes obvious in the line 1 king b7 takes b6, 2 a4 a5 check, king b6 a6. Note the bishop can't influence this light square either. 3 bishop b8 f4, for instance. 3 king a6 b7, 4 king b4 b5, king b7 a7, 5 a5 a6, king a7 a8. When a further advance of the white king, 6 king b5 b6, is not feasible because of the stalemate. So white must get the bishop off the b8 h2 diagonal. The game might then go 6 bishop f4 e3, king a8 b8, 7 king b5 b6, king b8 a8, and no more progress can be made, in that stalemate is given by advancing the pawn to a7. After 7 king b8 a8, white can try various things, but he can't force the black king from the corner. To do this, he'd need a knight, or a good bishop, here one that travels on light squares. Then a8 could be guarded, and the promotion of the a-pawn rendered certain. Which bishop should black take? The one on d7, or the one on d6? Incorrect. Don't take the bishop on d7. 1 king c7 takes d7. This capture allows white the ability to counter black's dark square bishop with white's own bishop, denying black the chance to set up a blockade on the dark squares. After 2 e4 e5, bishop g7 h6 check, 3 king f4 f5, white will be able to escort the pawns to victory. A possible continuation might be 3 bishop h6 d2, 4 bishop d6 c5, bishop d2 e1, 5 e5 e6 check, king d7 e8, 6 d5 d6, bishop e1 h4, 7 d6 d7 check, king e8 d8, which ends in mate via 8 bishop c5 b6 check, king d8 e7, 9 d7 d8 promote to queen, checkmate. Correct. Taking the dark square bishop, 1 king c7 takes d6, creates opposite color bishops, where the white and black bishops travel on squares of different color. In general, this situation often enables the defender to draw, even when behind by a couple of pawns, because of the possibility of a blockade. In such a scenario, both the defending king and bishop may be able to work together to control squares that the opposing bishop can't contest. This could effectively stop the advance of the enemy pawns, reducing the game to a practical draw. Thus, after 1 king c7 takes d6, black can draw by transferring his bishop back and forth along the a1 h8 diagonal, and there's nothing that white or his bishop can do about it. Black's king prevents the d-pawn from moving, and the e-pawn can never move because it would be taken for free. The game is drawn plain and simple, for no progress can be made. Should white promote to a queen or something else? Incorrect. The automatic move is to make a new queen, 1 d7 d8 promote to queen. But this ends in a draw after 1 queen c6 g6 check, 2 king g5 f4, queen g6 f6 check, forcing the trade of queens and leaving white with a rook pawn that black's king can blockade. A possible conclusion might be 3 queen d8 takes f6, king f7 takes f6, 4 h4 h5, king f6 g7, 5 king f4 g5, king g7 h7, 6 h5 h6, king h7 h8, 7 king g5 g6, king h8 g8, 8 h6 h7 check, king g8 h8, and 9 king g6 h6 is stalemate. Once again, sometimes more is less. Correct. Sometimes less is more. White wins, not by promoting to a queen, but by making a knight. 1 d7 d8, promote to knight, check. This is a forking check, attacking black's queen and king simultaneously. After black gets out of check, white's new knight removes the queen. 2 knight d8 takes c6. Even though white is left with a rook pawn, usually the weakest type of pawn, the white king and knight will be able to convoy it home without breaking a sweat. Should white stop mate or check the black king? 1 rook b8 b1 or 1 rook b8 g8 check? Incorrect. Withdrawing the rook to the home rank, 1 rook b8 b1 does one important thing. It thwarts the black mate threat at a1. But it doesn't provide white with any counterpunch, and now he's reduced to shifting his rook along the first rank, waiting for Godot. Meanwhile, black can head toward a win with 1 rook a2 g2 check. Now it doesn't matter where white goes with his king. If he moves it to the corner, 2 king g1 h1, black checks, 2 rook g2 h2 check. The king skids out of check, 3 king h1 g1, and then the pawn advances, 3 f3 f2 check, with fatal consequences. White can flee from the pawn check, 4 king g1 f1, but he can't save his rook after the skewering check 4 rook h2 h1 check, when it's captured for free next move, 5 king f1 e2, rook h1 takes b1. Nor does it help if white answers 1 rook a2 g2 check by avoiding the corner in favor of f1, 2 king g1 f1. For black's rook moves to the h-file anyway, 2 rook g2 h2, which threatens to move to h1, giving both a skewer as well as a mate. White can do no better than to move his king rearward to g1, 3 king f1 g1, and this gets us back into the previous variation, which ended with 3 f3 f2 check, etc. Clearly, given our starting position, a passive defense with the rook doesn't make it. Correct. To draw, white's rook must stay active. It should do all it can to harass the black king, beginning with a check along the back rank, 1 rook b8 g8 check. To this counter, there is no adequate response. Black, of course, can escape the check. Let's say 1 king g3 f4. But white has a new check, 2 rook g8 f8 check. And again, black must delay his own plans to extricate his king, say 2 king f4 e3. Another rook check, 3 rook f8 e8 check, will point out black's problem. He has no way to end the checks for good. Indeed, white can't do anything other than give checks, but they're good enough to prevent black from fulfilling his own aims, and the game is drawn. The active rook, here the rook with the ability to threaten the enemy king, saves the day. How should black attack the pawn? 1 rook g2 g7, or 1. Rook g2 h2. Incorrect. Attacking the pawn by moving the rook to black's second rank, 1. Rook g2 g7, is blunderous. It loses immediately, for white can move his own rook with a gain of time. 2. Rook h8 a8 check. True, this surrenders the white rook for free. 2. King a7 takes a8. But the sacrifice is quite ephemeral, for after white promotes the h-pawn to a queen, 3. h7 h8 promote to queen check, black finds himself in check. Worse than this, it's a fork, and after black escapes the check, 3. King a8 b7, he loses his rook to the newly formed queen. 4. Queen h8 takes g7 check. Correct. Stationing the black rook behind the passed pawn, 1. Rook g2 h2, sets up a draw. Now white can't sacrifice his rook with a time-gaining check at a8, 2. Rook h8 a8 check, for after the black king takes the rook, 2. King a7 takes a8. Black's own rook is in perfect position, behind the passed pawn, to halt the h-pawn's advance. So how can white try to win? If he attempts to bring his king over to the pawn to protect it, hoping to free his cornered rook, the black rook can check ceaselessly. And if white shifts gears and aims to bring his king back toward black's rook, black just keeps his rook on the h-file, making sure to stay far away from white's pestering king. No progress can be made, and the game ends in a positional draw. A corroborating variation, among the vast number of them, is 1. Rook g2 h2, 2. King f4 g3, rook h2 h6, 3. King g3 g4, rook h6 h1, 4. King g4 g5, rook h1 h2, 5. King g5 g6. This move unburdens white's rook, so black must act with dispatch. 7. Rook h2 g2 check. 6. King g6 f5, rook g2 f2 check. 7. King f5 g4, rook f2 h2. 8. King g4 g3, rook h2 h1. 9. King g3 g2, rook h1 h6, and white has gotten nowhere. The game is a practical draw. Should black move his rook or king? 1. Rook b1 h1, or 1. King d6 e5. Correct. Black has an instant win with 1. Rook b1 h1, clearing the b1 square and threatening to make a new queen with the rook's support. White has little choice but to take the pawn. 2. Rook b8 takes b2, whereupon black delivers a check at h2. 2. Rook h1 h2 check. This check is also a skewer, and after white moves his king out of check, the black rook takes the white rook for nothing. 3. Rook h2 takes b2. Incorrect. Moving the king toward the center, 1. King d6 e5 is worse than a misdemeanor. It allows white to set up a drawn position by sidling his king over to g2. 2. King f2 g2, which guards h1 and stops the black rook from sneaking around to h1 to set up a decisive skewer. And now there's no way to win. White's king prevents tactical tricks, and his rook is splendidly poised behind the passed pawn to prevent the black rook from moving without abandoning the b-pawn. Nor is black's king safe from annoyance, for it can be checked by white's rook whenever the circumstances require it. An exemplary variation is 1. King d6 e5, 2. King f2 g2, King e5 d4, 3. King g2 h2, King d4 c3, 4. Rook b8 c8 check, King c3 d4, 5 rook c8 d8 check, King d4 c5, 6 rook d8 c8 check, King c5 b6, 7 rook c8 b8 check, King b6 c7, 8 rook b8 b3, King c7 c6, 9 rook b3 b8, King c6 c5, 10 King h2 g2, and the game is utterly drawable. Should white make a new queen or check the black king? 1 b7 b8 promote to queen, or 1 queen a7 a6 check. Incorrect. You shouldn't be too hasty when on the verge of victory. Promoting at once 1 b7 b8 promote to queen may look inspiring, but clearly it proves injurious to white, as black is able to give a perpetual check, starting with 1 queen c7 c6 check. It doesn't matter which queen white uses to block the check, for black can continue issuing checks unendingly from then on. Black can't win, but he can prevent white from doing so, and the game therefore is drawn. An illustrative variation might go 1 b7 b8 promote to queen, queen c7 c6 check, 2 queen a7 b7, queen c6 a4 check, 3 queen b8 a7, queen a4 e8 check, 4 queen b7 b8, queen e8 c6 check, 5 queen b8 b7, queen c6 e8 check, 6 queen a7 b8, queen e8 a4 check, 7 queen b7 a7, queen a4 c6 check, and this ring-around-the-rosy approach gets nowhere. The game is drawn by perpetual check, confirming the fact that an extra queen doesn't always win. Correct. If white keeps his eyes open, he delays promoting in favor of a security check, 1 queen a7 a6 check. Wherever black moves his king to get out of the check, say 1 king h6 g5, white can then promote 2 b7 b8 promote to queen, and black doesn't have a single safe check, let alone a full perpetual. No matter how black uses his second move, white's material superiority will soon bring down the black king. Occasionally, you have to show a little patience. Should white take a pawn or give a check? 1 queen e2 takes e6, or 1 queen e2 h5 check. Incorrect. This is no time to be materialistic. Taking the king pawn, 1 queen e2 takes e6, is unreasonably greedy. It also stumbles into black's unexpected saving grace, 1 queen f4 f7. To this bold stroke, which pins the white queen to its king, white has no choice but to accept the sacrifice 2 queen e6 takes f7. But taking the queen leaves black without a single move, and according to the rules of chess, this is stalemate. The game is drawn, and once again we see that more can turn out to be less.